Hey everybody, this is Eric Anthony with All Things MSP. We're going live tonight at 6 o'clock, and this is the pre-show. As you can see, we have 22 minutes to go. And in the meantime, we'll be talking to Ian Trump about his thoughts on different things like Meltdown and Spectre, things like that, until we start the real show. Tonight, what we're really going to be talking about is event log checks and how we can use those event log checks in terms of security and watching for just malicious actions. Ian actually has a white paper on this that we will be putting into the post once the video goes up online. And so you'll be able to get that when you need to. So without further ado, I am going to switch over. And hey, Ian, how are you doing?
I'm good, man. Thank you so much, Eric, for inviting me on the show. I'm really excited. And it's a little bit late here, but I do my best work at night, so we're good.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, Ian is over in the UK right now, which is where you're spending most of your time, isn't it?
Yeah, I had a very busy December with a lot of trips, and just, of course, with the Christmas holidays and all that kind of stuff. Calming a bit down, I am working out of London, so we have this work 2 days from home, work 3 days in London, so been doing some commuting, but nothing like the long hauls that I did working for SolarWinds MSP, that's for sure.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, Ian and I kind of share a similar trait in that we have both been MSPs as well as vendors in the channel. We've both worked for SolarWinds MSP, actually going back to, let's see, Hound Dog, Max, Logic, SolarWinds. How's that?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So we've been, I mean, how long have you been involved with the monitoring product?
I guess it would have been, I'm going to say about 2014 because I was at
No, it had to be earlier than that.
it was way earlier because I was thinking about in its iterations. I was one of the original Hound Dog people in Canada, and I worked for the company for a year when it was just starting out. And that was with Kelly O'Bray and Dave Wilson, Doug Wilson's brother. So I did tech support for them for about a year, and then I went off to do the RCMP, cyber criminal analyst stuff, and then I started up basically a security focused MSP. And that's when I sort of got recruited to come on board GFI for about like 4 days, and then it morphed into Logic Now, sort of right before my very eyes. So, so it's a little bit weird to talk about it because it was a completely different company. It went from like startup to mature startup to now a giant behemoth in the channel, like, with the 20,000 customers worldwide and over 5 million endpoints now. So just a really interesting success story and having sort of like snippets as I went through. Yeah.
Well, and it's been interesting having been on both sides of the fence, right? Because back then, well, let's see, you and I met in what, 2009, 2010 at the first GFI Max conference?
I think so. Yeah, that sounds about right.
In fact, we were both speaking at that conference.
Yeah,
I remember.
yeah.
Okay.
And they invited me in to be a customer distributor a spokesperson about how to really do MSP, because back then managed service providers were they were a rarity in the marketplace. It was mostly break fix. And the key to sort of transitioning to MSP, if you will, was really getting in that monitoring to do that proactive services. And that was sort of the bandwagon that, Auto Task Connect wise, SolarWinds MSP, all of those folks, really that market, I'm going to say, didn't exist before like 2007, really.
Right. And even in 2007, 2010 in there, and even at that conference that you and I met with, most of those guys were still doing break fix.
Mm-hmm.
And MSP was a new thing.
Yeah, and we were preaching that, there's opportunities in that MSP space and, the reoccurring revenue model, which has great appeal. But, it's funny because over time, certainly with the security thing that we're going to talk to you today, being an MSP now it's a tough thing. It's not easy to get folks to ante up the money for services in advance. And I think you deal with people that are struggling with that all the time.
Well, that's true, and it's especially when I was starting out as an MSP, because I was a break fix company for 10 years before that, and
Okay.
so
Yeah.
when I started doing MSP, yeah, you're right, and especially in rural areas like I was in, it was very unusual for a computer guy to come in and say, "Hey, I want you to pay me up front to take care of this stuff that you would normally just hire somebody to come in and do when it broke."
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, it was crazy back then.
And the war stories too about just printers and Windows 95 as an operating system and Windows 98. I mean, all of that
Yeah.
stuff. Um, we had a product reliability problem back then with the hardware that has more or less gone away in the marketplace. But what is really interesting is we've seen the commoditization of the platform. So, be it a tablet, a workstation, a laptop, the data is now way more important than the hardware,
Right.
right?
Right, because the hardware you can replace at any time, but the data is where the value is. And your big companies know that, right? Google, is built on data.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting because we've now and I look at a lot of small businesses and do and advise them on compliance and security, and one of the biggest things that we find is that their new server that they have actually is copies of the last four servers that they've had,
Right.
that they've upgraded. And the Christmas list from like 2003 is still live on the platters, right? And it's like
Yeah.
you know there's this I think a real kind of change in approach in that the more data you have, the more risk that you have in your business now. And so I think one of the future trends that I like to talk about with managed service providers is managing data, and actually working with the customer to say, do you need this? Do you need this? Do you need this? Because it's cumbersome to back up that much data. It's cumbersome to try and restore the data if something, goes sideways. It's risk because if it's stolen, especially in medical records or things like that. So I think it's almost like MSPs are evolving into data management and security, as opposed to the original sort of, hey, we've noticed that your monitoring has told us that you're offline. Go reboot the modem
Right.
to get back online. Um,
So, first of all, I want to just tell everybody real quick that please go ahead and comment so that we know you're here. Let us know if you have any questions. We still have, almost 14 minutes before we start the show. And Ian and I would love to take any questions that you have now.
Absolutely.
But we were talking about data and the importance of data and how hardware is becoming less important. And I guess we can use that as a segue kind of into Meltdown and Spectre,
Yeah.
because Meltdown and Spectre are kind of new and original compared to other types of vulnerabilities because they actually attack at the processor level. And
Yeah.
so, what are your thoughts on that, Ian?
So it's interesting because back in about, I think it was probably around 2009, there was a lot of security research going into the BIOS and compromising the BIOS and putting in persistent backdoors at the BIOS level. And at the time when the security researchers, there were two guys from Argentina that were presenting their paper at CanSec West, they talked about a whole host of vulnerabilities at that basic input output level on the machines. It does not strike me as, the ridiculousness that we have these same type of vulnerabilities inside the processors. Now, there is two types of, I'm going to say, approaches that I'm seeing out on the internet right now. One is, it's a giant conspiracy theory that these vulnerabilities were put in at the request of certain government agencies in order to, I'm going to say, advance the nation state surveillance capabilities. Okay? And the supporting evidence for this is pretty sketchy and thin. It's basically like, how come we're just finding out about this now? And it's interesting because there's been a couple lawsuits launched in Spectre Meltdown that are suggesting that the vendors knew about this way before it blew up on Twitter. And it blew up, and the security research community went, oh my God, and there's much freaking out. Another conspiracy theory suggests that due to the, I'm going to say, the economies of scale in the massive data centers that we're building, the lack of on-premise, this is the final nail in the coffin to any legacy hardware that's out there. Welcome to the cloud, where our prices just went up by 30% because of the performance hit. So there's a massive amount of confusion, and where there's confusion, I'm going to say there's alternate realities that people embrace. At the end of the day, though, and this is the thing that made me go a little bit mental, it's this. The vulnerability only works if you execute code on the actual workstation. So this is not like a dude in a hoodie can attack your processor through your firewall, from Estonia. Okay? This is the same phishing email, but just with a different payload, just with a different set of codes that exploits a vulnerability. Now, the problem is this is an absolute bitch to fix because it's a firmware update followed by an operating system kernel update followed by a browser update. And getting all three right is difficult. And in the early stages, I think the industry, and I'm looking at you, Intel, and Microsoft, and Firefox, and all the rest of the vendors, everybody kind of went batshit crazy and rushed a bunch of patches, which apparently bricked some AMD machines, caused about these massive performance hits that SolarWinds actually showed was very impactful to private cloud architectures because they have a performance monitoring solution, and everybody was like, oh my God. And so, this then, of course, became a major problem for the cloud vendors. Because all of a sudden, the workloads that you had spun up with, 2 cores and 4 gigs of RAM, all of a sudden now had to go to 4 cores and 18 gigs of RAM. And, you got into this thing where it became expensive. Right. And that was the difficulty, is that, it's not just the expense that you immediately incur, but it's all that legacy hardware that's going to have to be dealt with at some point.
Yeah, because it is, like you said, it's at the hardware level. So bringing all of the things in place, and we've seen that in patching, and how the antivirus had to be patched first, and then the operating system, and then you go further into the into the firmware updates and things like that. But it is going to mean a whole generation of new processors, right?
Absolutely. And the litigation will go on for years. I mean, this is a bonanza, and I'm glad you brought up the antivirus issue, because there were some vendors that suffered quite a bit because the antivirus is incompatible with some of the patches that were rushed out into the marketplace. And when you do that as a supposedly hardware neutral vendor, like I build a CPU that, any operating system can run on it, any software should run on it, and now it's discriminatory against certain types of software and certain operating systems. It's like bringing into the market right now a hard drive that doesn't work on Windows.
Right.
Right? It's like you're not going to sell a lot of those.
Yeah, it makes things difficult.
So it's been a nightmare, and I think the paradigm of here's this massive vulnerability out there, and people just kind of launching it into the ether. There has to be some sort of balance because it shell shocked everybody out there. It wasn't good for the market. It's certainly not good for the vendors.
Well, it wasn't good for the MSPs either, because
No.
it created a lot of work on their part for what is primarily a hardware vendor issue.
And this goes back to the problem of being an MSP and having a contract that is just too vague on what services you're there to perform, because you're going to eat those costs. You're the one that's going to debug programs that aren't working because of the latest patch from the operating system to the application to the processor. So for MSPs, I think the impact of this may actually be even bigger because those small, medium customers are already pretty thrifty, and convincing them that they have to throw out all of their stuff and get new stuff, is going to be tough.
So you brought up a great point that I want to go into a little bit, and that is the contract. Because this is something that you should make sure is not covered in your contract as an MSP, because it's a risk that you can't take on. It's not your fault. It's not your responsibility, and your contract needs to state that. Also,
and so many MSPs are not addressing those kind of like force majeure type of scenario.
Yeah, and the other thing that it also speaks to is standardization. So the more standardized your environment is, the easier it would have been to remedy this across all of your clients. And we see that in mature MSPs all the time, right? They're much more standardized, not just within one client, but across their entire client base to make sure they're using the same type of hardware, the same type of software. If for Meltdown and Spectre specifically, if you were having to deal with 4 or 5 or 6 different antivirus products, that would have been much more difficult for you to remediate across the board, instead of just using one.
I couldn't agree with you more on that. One of the challenges that the industry has, and goes from enterprise to small, medium businesses, is configuration management and managing the infrastructure. Now, unfortunately, the MSP that went to market with AMD would have had difficulty if they rushed that first round of patches because of hysteria, or they didn't test them on their own platform before rolling them out, which is something that I really recommend, because anybody that's patched SQL anything or Exchange anything knows that that's like the danger zone. Kenny Loggins will pop out as you're touching those type of boxes, right? So again, I agree with you, Eric. The problem I think that we face as MSPs is you can't convince sometimes a customer that has 10 boxes that they need a Meraki, right? And your customer that has 50 boxes also has a Meraki. So what do? You find something like Ubiquity, or you find something else, and it's that something else. So I almost see MSPs starting to do if you're below 25 people, our technology stack just isn't appropriate for you. So, find a different MSP.
Right, and there's always going to be a market for that. There's going to be a market for that. I don't want to call it lower end, but smaller quantity of devices where they just can't afford the investment in that type of standardization at the level that your MSP is at. Now,
Yeah.
there are plenty of other MSP there that would love that business and will take that business in a minute. But as you mature, you need to kind of scale back on the types of customers because they're just not going to be as profitable as the customers that you know you're you're looking at
That
for your
yeah.
more mature MSP.
Yeah, and I think one of your other challenges too is in that space, you now have inherited quite possibly an unsupported legacy application in the smaller and I'm going to say below 20, 25 seats. It's quite possibly they haven't made the investments in the technology. And if you rush them into MSP without a remediation project, you're now going down the road of basically rebuilding their network through support tickets.
Yeah, exactly.
which we've all been there, right?
Oh yeah. So we have our first comment, Ian, and
Oh,
it's
okay.
from somebody that we all recognize. It's Mr. Todd Hogland.
Hey,
So
Todd.
hey Todd, good evening. Thanks for joining and thanks for sharing. And oh yeah, thanks for telling me to keep the wall. Um,
I love the wall,
the
man. It's
the
so
lovely.
gangster.
Hey, I had to do it, right?
Yeah. That's good. Did Todd have a question, or is he just saying
No,
shout
he
out?
just said that he showed up and he shared
Oh,
and
nice.
told me to keep the
So
wall.
I'll just clue our audience in. It was kind of like the three MSP musketeers, Todd and Eric and myself back in the day. Todd handles all the training now for the SolarWinds MSP Academy process, where you can get certified on the dashboard that we're going to talk about tonight. And I've known Todd probably about the same time I met you.
Yeah, yeah, probably almost exactly because I think it was Todd and Chip who brought me in to present at that first GFI Max conference. So yeah, it
Yeah.
would have been about the same time.
So MSPs, here's a reminder: if you ever get an invite to come and present at a conference, you might end up working there.
Hey, I can't complain. It hasn't worked out bad.
Good. Awesome.
And good evening, Sean. I know Sean's a longtime customer of Wins
Cool.
MSP, now Max Hound Dog.
That's great. It'll be like getting together with family here.
Yep, I'm gonna have to use, of course, that amalgamation, several times tonight.
Sure.